The idea of remembering our history is so vital, God repeats it multiple times from the prophets and both the writers of the New Testament.
What was it that made America special? Remembering might matter more than you know. Let's talk about it with Carl Creasman on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we're so glad you're here. Spending an hour with us in the midst of a busy schedule is an amazing gift. And we see it as that, but frankly, we're doing the same with you. So you ought to see it as a gift, in case you're wondering. I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Our executive producer, Matthew Porter, is here. Makes sense that Matthew is a Floridian. Florida is right at sea level. And so were Matthew's grades in school. You too. I ran away from kindergarten and graduated third from the bottom in a large high school. No. Our producer, Jeremy's in the little glass booth. Jeremy, just a question. Do you still have all your fingers after the 4th of July celebration?
I do, but I tried really hard.
Our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in his tech bunker, or maybe he's already taken off for his vacation. No, he won't show himself on any of our cameras. He might not even be here. Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life, and if you would like to make a tax-deductible donation, the doctor will see you now.
And hurry, you only have 6 months left.
And Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Kathy says she will not be seeing the new Jurassic Park movie. If she wants to see a dinosaur causing chaos, she'll just come into my office.
Matthew, that was a good one.
We have a great guest, and we heard about him because Matthew is his friend, and they've been working together on some of this material. And Matthew was telling me and then giving me some of the podcasts so I could listen, and I was impressed. Dr. Carl Creasman has spent 30 years in Christian ministry, leadership, and communication, most recently serving 18 years as a senior pastor for a really weird church. If you can do that for 15 years, you got the 3 extra are just crowns, but you can get to heaven without Jesus. Since 2002, Carl has served as professor of history at Valencia College in Orlando. He's written several books, and most recently created a podcast, and it's called Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Carl, you didn't have enough to do? You decided to do
the Hamilton musical, Steve. There's that line where Aaron Burr's character says about Hamilton that the man is nonstop, and I think Matthew and my wife would both say that's I'm guilty as charged.
Well, it doesn't seem to me like you have any spare time for anything else. So it had better be good. That's all, because it's going to cause a divorce, and I thought I would just let you know about that. What started? Or did you just look at the nation and think, "Man, this is bad. What's wrong?" and I'm going to say something and find out what the problem is? Or has this been a place of concern for you most of your ministry?
It has been a place of concern for most of my ministry, and probably around 2010 or 2011, I started feeling like I was noticing some evidence of societal change from a variety of signals that were coming. And at that time, while I was still leading the church, felt like God was leading me to really consider what happened to the nation of Israel, to his chosen people, as referenced in the fall to the Assyrians and to the Babylonians, kind of the move into that period of time where God was punishing his people. And then after that, with Nehemiah, the wall building, we did a real long process of examining that in our church. And so from around that time of 2010, 2011, I really began feeling like there was an increased sense of movement that was happening to the country. That aspect of examining societies as they change over time has been kind of core to my historical work as a professor from my earliest days of research. So kind of noticing what happens to societies, why do they change? They do always change, and kind of what's in the mix. And then probably in the last 4 or 5 years, is around 2021, 22, that I really felt like God really pressing on me that our problem is a spiritual issue, and that there are kind of wings of our society that have, in essence, gone to war with each other, or deeply gone into deep struggle, which is also clearly evident within the Christian community itself. In some of my research, I was really shocked and perhaps saddened to find, multiple books published over the past 10 years, and you can almost clearly divide them as Christians saying the problem is here versus Christians saying the problem is here, but they're at each other. And so I felt like with my historical background, I had a way to kind of really dive into that and kind of triangulate down into what I think is one of the core issues that we've arrived to some degree, if not a large degree, at this situation because we've forgotten our own history or only have a poor understanding of our history so as to lead to poor conclusions that we kind of derive as we think, we should do X, Y, or Z.
We're going to agree on what your analysis is. You've done a lot of thinking, a lot of research, and a lot of work on it. But just in case this is going to be a dark hour and we're all going to be suicidal, you got any hope?
Well, there's always hope. I mean, we know that we serve a God of hope, and he calls us to a confident hope because of him and because of his central movement, that he's on a large redemptive story. And then we can also drive a hope through his work and ministry by recognizing that the church in America or the church in the West may be sick or ill, but the church itself is quite healthy. It's thriving and moving and changing lives all over the planet. And it would help many Americans to perhaps go on some international mission trips to see how strong God's church is moving. And then I think that could also then lead us to some self-reflection to recognize, one of the central things that we came to in the research was that, in my opinion, the American church, whether the more conservative side or the more liberal side, believes that the problem is lying out there, like somebody's done something to us. And the research for me was overwhelmingly clear, both kind of civically and looking at research from people like Gallup or Barna or Pew, as well as looking at the Bible, that the problem is not external, the problem is internal. Nobody's done anything to us, but God's people, the people who claim God in the United States, have quite honestly failed to live into that calling, to live into his call for an upside down world, for lifestyle uniqueness that, of course, just any casual read through the scripture is clear. One of the things that I started the whole podcast off, and when Matthew and I were discussing, was pointing out what I think some of the major ills, and one of the easiest ones to see is that the country post-World War II has become addicted to ease and comfort. Well, the Christian church has joined in that. The Christians also, whether at a moment where they could have perhaps demonstrated some lifestyle uniqueness and not pursued the same level of comfort and ease that the nation has fallen into, instead followed along. So when we think, where's the problem lie, our hope then becomes, we can solve this not internally, but through Jesus and through deciding to once again align myself no matter how hard it is, and it is hard, I find it hard, but to align myself with his calling into this unique worldview of how to live and not allow myself to use the prophet's way of saying it, not allow myself to fall into an idolatry where I'm worshiping something else, whether that worship is of ESPN, of gaming, of shopping, of Amazon, of streaming TV, of my children, of my job. These are all things that we have set up, in my opinion, as idol worship. And idol worship is the number one things the prophet spoke about in saying, this is where the problem lies.
Mm. Well, you're encouraging. I just got an Amazon package this morning.
Hey, all those things are things I struggle with too.
I don't feel guilty enough already. I gotta. No, I think your analysis is so true, but it's so difficult, isn't it? I mean, we've got a culture that's powerful in terms of drawing us to things that become our idols. And it's so easy to slip into that. Guys, we're going to take a break after receiving the prophecy from our friend. We need to repent and pray and fast. And so we're going to do that for a little bit. So we'll be prepared when we come back. The podcast, by the way, and we'll be giving you some information on how to get there, is Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness, and Finding Our Way Back. Guys, we're going to go, but we're going to find our way back, so don't go anywhere. Thanks for being a part of this. We're talking to Professor and author Carl Creasman about his podcast, Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back.
Dr. Creasman, I feel like, I wish I had little glasses. I'd be like,
you want to borrow mine?
Dr. Creasman. You talk about us forgetting our past, and I don't even think you have to make a hard case for that. I think that's anybody would agree. We've kind of lost that. But to say, okay, let's remember our founding. I think a lot of people go, yeah, right. We're a Christian nation. We were founded as. Talk to us about that. There's some nuances in answering that question.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Actually, let me start first by saying, the idea of remembering our history is so vital. God repeats it multiple times from the prophets and both the writers of the New Testament. I mean, that was one of the big takeaways. So for the research, I read through all the prophets to kind of get a grip on, like, what is God saying to his people? So if the American church, at least the church from when I grew up, sees itself often as, the current God's people, I thought, well, maybe there's lessons for us to be learned, or for me to be learned, by reading through what did God say through the prophets. And so there's a lot there, but one of the things that just comes out repeatedly by the prophets is from God to his people is, you've forgotten. And so that idea of remembering becomes so central, and we as a people forget. And in one sense, I think that's maybe normal. It's probably been true for all peoples and all places, that they're just kind of an easy forgetfulness, and we struggle to understand, history. But I think it's impossible for you to know yourself if you don't know your personal history. I always encourage my students to find the oldest person in your family alive and sit down and ask them questions, and then shut up and listen.
That would be me.
And then civically, it's also true, that idea of knowing who we are. So there's been a lot of misunderstanding that has developed. And I think from that misunderstanding of our national history, you kind of have two wings that I alluded to in the prior segment. And one wing is that, well, we were founded as a Christian nation. And the other wing was like, no, Christianity and religion really had nothing to do with it. And both are fundamentally wrong if we're going to trust the evidence. And so when you examine the evidence and you look whether at the founding from the colonial days, And when you and I talked, one of the things we looked at was the first 4 founding colonies in the 1600s. And there's obviously more after that, but we looked to see was there clues there. Abundantly clear was that they had no intent of establishing a nation except maybe the Puritans. And though we could say 3 of the 4 were Christian based, they were coming for a freedom of Christian expression. So they wanted to be able to do their Christian faith as they felt led, but they weren't doing that in some way to say, well, let's establish a nation by which we're independent. And when you look at those, particularly the Catholics in Maryland and the Pilgrims in Plymouth, you see them reaching out to people of other faiths, whether other Christian faiths, which was in their minds, another Christian faith was not like just a buddy faith. It was very different. So they came to exclude, and you see that with the Puritans when they kicked out people who didn't have the Puritan faith when they established their colonies. But so we can't say that there was, the way we said it on the podcast was, it's appropriate and correct to say that this was a nation peopled mostly with Christians. And so then when you move forward to say 1776, which obviously we just celebrated, Independence Day, and next year is the 250. It's one of the big round numbers that we all love. And we think about what was done there. Or if you fast forward to 1787, when the second governing document is written, what you see is those founders kind of acknowledging and balancing the reality of that it was a nation peopled mostly with Christians, and there was a Christian heritage that was crucial for what they believed to be a necessary foundation to do their style of government. And at the same time, they never enshrined that in some way to be what we would today think of as we should be a Christian nation, or even the more extreme version of sort of Christian nationalism. They never did anything like that. So if we trust the evidence, what we find in our history is kind of the founders from the colonial days all the way to the establishment of the nation, really walking a tightrope in which they were acknowledging the idea of what we might think of as Enlightenment principles, maybe even to some degree, although I wouldn't press this, a deistic kind of viewpoint, but at the same time, the Christian God. And you get this in the Declaration where we say in that early section, John Adams, Franklin, Jefferson, those guys were the principal writers there, are saying, that we want to be aware of both the laws of nature and nature's God. So they're kind of trying to talk about both things together and walk on what was a very unique path at that time.
Oh, man, that is interesting.
Yeah.
And in a way I haven't thought about. There's a sense in which your message is directed to Christians. I can't believe that a lot of atheists are rising up and calling you blessed. But insofar as your message is successful, their freedom will be affirmed to not believe, or to believe far differently than what you and I believe. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. And I would just say, and obviously this is anecdotal and people talking to me, but a healthy percentage of people who listen to the podcast were not Christians, some who were atheists, because we were talking to the nation. So the podcast is, if somebody listens from your audience, who I would assume mostly would be Christians,
Yeah.
you need to be aware that the focus, that what we were talking to was sort of the nation at large. And so there is not a sense of where Matthew and I were in any sense trying to like proselytize or kind of walk down a road of proving Christianity supreme. Although if you listen to episode 5 and 6, we really delve into the benefit that Christianity has brought to Western culture. But to really talk to everybody should be concerned where we are nationally. I mean, I was interviewed recently by another setting, and they were like, well, what's the principal message? I'm like, well, the principal message is the nation is in trouble if you like the nation that we established, which at the time of its establishment, and I would suggest into the 20th century, was both the envy of the world and the model for the world. As Lincoln talked about, with it being the last best hope kind of a situation. And so people thought in terms of, we want to be like that. Well, we've clearly lost that. Now, again, Matthew and I really stress this. There's no triumphalistic. We're not saying America is the greatest country in the world ever. We're not saying any sort of a focus on what's often called American exceptionalism. But when you look at the data, it's clear if you were ranking all societies of all time, we'd be like in the top 5. And so we've lost that. And we're in the same sort of trouble that other groups before. If you look at the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, other places have existed and then fallen away, and some to complete fall away. And if you say, well, I want to try to save us, then that's everybody at the table. And that's our non-Christians, our Christians, people of various faiths. And I think that there's lessons that can help us find our way to navigate forward, or as the title says, finding our way back to safe harbor is the idea.
Oh, good stuff. We're talking with Carl Creasman, and you've got to listen to this podcast. We'll tell you how you can find it. Unmoored, America Adrift, and Historical Forgetfulness, and Finding Our Way Back. If you're not a Christian, I don't know why you're listening or watching this, but if you're not a Christian, this is good for you too. So deal with it. We're going to return like Jesus. We're hanging out with professor, author, and podcast host Carl Creasman. You can keep up with him at Carl and Creasman, that's CREASMAN.com. Do we just get your podcast by going to wherever we get podcasts and put your name in?
You can, and you'd put it on more to be good. But if you go to that website, carlcreasman.com, all the links are there, as well as to my social media stuff.
Okay, good.
Carl, geez, a lot of different directions come to mind. The Unmoored, you're talking about unmoored from our history, but also unmoored from even the idea of objective truth. I mean, we've drifted more and more into, I guess, technological advancement. We can all make our own choices, finally chosen, and suddenly we become our own God or something. So our truth is the truth. But I digress. One of the things we were talking about was the idea of that with the education system and the changes to the education system and how it addresses history, how it addresses the idea of truth. And frankly, I was wondering if they even still teach, any kind of civics or that government, the concept of the development of the United States in public school. But is that a good enough jumping off point for you in terms of how the education system is related?
Yeah, sure. I mean, particularly back to the question of that we've lost touch with our history. I'd say in Florida for sure, which is really all one I can speak of, for the past 10 years, there has been a focus on civics, and they do still teach the basics of American history and American governing system. And we've been, implementing, we meaning the state of Florida, and Valencia, where I teach, has to do this along with all the other, public institutions, instituting a test students have to pass for civics. The problem with that, though, and this gets away from the podcast and really more into kind of a philosophy of learning issue, is that, in my opinion, at least since the 90s, we have, as a nation, focused a lot less on the idea of learning and much more on the idea of test passing or test completing, so that then people can feel good about themselves as a society or city or, a state, saying, oh, look, our kids have learned at this level based on this multiple choice test that we've given them. And I would just contend with that if I was in an educational meeting setting, where I would say, I don't know that demonstrates true learning. And particularly when you get up to the level of where we think of citizens. So say, imagine somebody 16 years or older, where we're really kind of expecting them to understand the principles of engagement as a citizen. In fact, that is one of the most important things that we have lost when you look at what it means to be in a republic, which is what we are and what the Romans were. It was based around the idea of an invested citizen. But if I don't understand what citizen actually means, then I don't know how to be invested in that. And then you kind of just get this watered down thing. And honestly, one of the places where it shows up as an example of how we don't understand our own history and this idea of an invested citizen is when we get a jury summons. For most people, they see a jury summons as some negative, some horrible thing to get out of. If you go back in time and you tell some random people anywhere on the planet, we're going to let you as regular citizens sit in judgment on your peers so as to protect them from the central government or the king or the noble making an arbitrary decision, they'd pass out. They'd be like, what are you talking about? When can I do that? I love that idea. And we have lost so much what it means to be a citizen, and we kind of blow it off. So I think even though we have civics tests, we're not really learning and instilling in our young people, and to some degree, I'd say this is now complicit through or kind of rife through the entire society. So it's even the 80-year-olds, the 70-year-olds would look and see, I don't really know what it even means to be a citizen. I'm not around that. I think it connects, you mentioned earlier in your lead-in, the idea of what we would basically call postmodernism or seeking one's own truth. This plays into that ill that I said of being addicted to ease and comfort, because if I'm addicted to ease and comfort, as I would suggest to everybody, and I'm including Carl, in that setting that we're in, then I'm uncomfortable with anything that imposes itself on me. So I'm likely to want to move to a thought process or philosophy that, of course, is untenable at any moment of challenge, but on the surface sounds great, where I can only pick the things that make me happy. And so I kind of moved down that road. And then you tie that ill in with what was the third major ill that I believe was crucial to setting this crisis in motion, is that we have this kind of idea of hyper-individuality, which also is a failure of our history. People think of the rugged American individual. Well, that's false on its face. I mean, occasionally, yes, you had a Davy Crockett or a Daniel Boone, but in general terms, whenever we were going into the wilderness, whenever we were setting up colonies, we were doing it as a community. And we lived and survived together as a community. When you examine Jamestown in particular, but the Pilgrims really affirm this, we can't and will not make it if we don't pull together and work together. And Jamestown almost failed a decade, 15 years in, because they failed to see that. And then they made a real sharp transition to say, look, we've got to really work together and really build family community here as a way to save ourselves.
Oh, man, that's a long way back. The podcast, Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Guys, this is really important stuff. You ought to listen very carefully and check out the podcast. We're going to sell product and then return. Glad that you're spending time with us. If you're watching us on YouTube, we just got early access to a cool new feature. You can now hear our content in Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Japanese, and Southern. I'm kidding around, but I'm being serious. This really is a new feature, and you might want to try it out on youtube.com/KeyLife Network. Gracias.
We already had Southern because we had you. We don't need that one. Got that covered. Carl, I grew up in New England, Connecticut to be precise. And back in those dark ages, when I was in the 7th grade in 1961. I feel like I got a much greater handle on the earlier days of this particular country, et cetera, and so forth, because there's something about being part of the original 13 or whatever that made you feel like you really were cool. I don't know if there's an ounce of truth in that at all, but I sure feel like I, even to this day, remember a lot of stuff that, kids aren't, we've already talked about the education system now that kids are not learning. But anyway, in the 7th grade, our civics class wrote and presented I guess you call it a bill, to the Senate and the House in the state of Connecticut to make December 7th a holiday in the state of Connecticut to fly flags at half-staff for Pearl Harbor Day. And it was passed. And I think eventually it actually went to the U.S. and it was passed as a holiday or whatever. I'm not sure of all but anyway, we thought we were really, really big time and really had a lot to offer the world, I guess. I just mentioned that because I felt like I had to. You alluded or mentioned in an earlier segment about episode 6, and I wondered if of the podcast, and I wondered if you could just expand on that just a little bit. The subject matter in that is has Christianity really benefited the West, and how so?
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing, and this is the part of when I said earlier that a large percentage of our listeners were people who are of no faith or even of an atheistic position, and that segment in particular was one that we targeted or wanted to affirm. The whole idea of how I was building the podcast was, I guess, first to say to my Christian friends, hold up. There's more you need to learn, and there's lessons from your own, spiritual historical writings you need to learn. And then when we walked through that through antiquity, in fact, I think we even led in the episode by saying one could then say, "See, told you Christianity is a terrible idea." And it was like, not so fast. And so when you look at the history of the West, and the West meaning moving Western civilization through, we would say basically Europe, and then through the West children, right? So the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, really all of South America as well, coming from Spain, you see these legacies kind of pass through. And when you then look and see, well, what does the West, or what developed in the West that you could say maybe is unique? And one of the things that happens is the coming of Christianity, obviously in the middle of the journey. So I'm teaching right now a class on, the antiquity, and we start in 3,500 BC. So the idea of West and Western culture is ancient. And then, the middle of that run, Christianity emerges. And we know as Christians, there's a larger story that God's been working on that is the true story of the world, right? But for somebody in a history class, they don't necessarily know that, although in my class, I'm dropping bits and pieces of that in. And so you begin to say, well, I see normative setting for societies all across, the globe. And then I start seeing the West, who also followed in on these normative positions, adopting something different. And so there's a whole host of things that Christianity introduced. So, and this kind of gets into, when people are like, well, is there any hope, or what do we do? And I keep saying, well, first of all, Christians need to recognize that God's view for his people is to always be the minority culture. That one of the great dangers that happens to us as Christians when we become the majority culture. And then in that idea of minority culture, when you look at the ancient documents from non-Christians who are observing the Christians in, 100 AD or so, they're noting these people are so weird. They have lifestyle uniqueness that is odd to the normative state of how humans operate. And so all those lifestyle uniqueness points kind of come flowing in. So here's a couple of examples, right? They didn't abandon their children. They didn't allow for children to be left alone or die. This kind of connects into, obviously, one of God's core people that he's interested in is caring for orphans, right? They shared their meals with their neighbors, even those neighbors who weren't Christians. So they were sharing their resources with the poor. So that's another one of the places where God really invests himself. You just read the Bible, it's consistently. He's concerned about the least or those who are less fortunate or not well off. They had a unique sexual ethic that Romans in particular were just mind blown that they did this. And it's a longer story. We don't have time to get into it. But generally speaking, when you read the Bible, you're looking at an odd idea that suggests that one, marriage is meant to honor both people. Paul says very clearly in Ephesians that we are to submit one to another as equals, and that there's a sense of taming is not the right word, but there's a transforming of the male role relative to the wife in marriage. That's not done anywhere else on the planet. Another thing that comes up from, again, lifestyle uniquenesses is that Christians allowed or encouraged anybody to join their group. When you go back and you study antiquity, what you find are all the gods and philosophies that guided for different peoples in different places. Those were unique to location, to person. There's, the God of that city. And here the Christians come along and say anybody is welcome because, again, as Christians, you and I know, Kathy, that God wants everybody to get saved. And so this was really odd to them that they would include people who weren't of a same ethnicity or same group. They honored women. Women were in church leadership. I know this isn't a popular thing people want to talk about today, but the historical evidence is clear and overwhelming. And so they allowed women to be honored in a variety of roles that in the ancient societies they were not. They set up learning institutions. They set up the first hospitals. They set up the first efforts to end slavery. I know the Bible can be taken to task about slavery, but when it's read collectively in context with the ancient world, you start going, wait a minute, these guys have got some unique idea. And then in the United States and in England, obviously with Wilberforce, but in the United States, you have the very first anti-slavery societies set up. So we're obviously complicit for our role in slavery and for the length of time slavery happens. And at the same time, you have these American Christians who are saying, this can't be the way we're going to do things. So there's just a variety of things that kind of build in strength to say these Christians are doing something odd. And that's what made people who are in the faith stand out differently. And that's what we've lost right now.
And your teaching, do it again. Carl, this hour has gone by fast, and I would urge people to check out the podcast. It'll blow you away. Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Carl, God bless you. What a good hour. I was thinking the program was over.
I know.
And was getting ready to walk out the door. Now I got to think of something to say, but I'll keep talking till something comes to mind. One of the things we discussed with Carl off the air was that awakening and revival is the real hope that we have for our country. Because people are not going to give up their idols. Once you're there, you're stuck because it's addictive. But when God intervenes, and that's what happened in the Great Awakening, it also happened in the Jesus Revolution. And if you haven't seen that movie, you ought to see it. I was there, and it wasn't anything we did. We weren't particularly spiritual. We didn't pray to see it happen. We didn't repent to see it happen. God just decided these people are in trouble and I'm going to do something to fix it. And he did. And so maybe that's what we should expect. But the thing that Carl said off the air, which is really important, is that revival and awakening isn't for them, it's for us. If you're not a believer, I get that. And I'm not, this is not an evangelistic broadcast. So that's fine if you don't want If you want to go to hell, you go ahead. And no, I understand that. But if you're a believer, God starts with us. He doesn't start with them. The scripture is very clear about awakening begins with the house of God. And so what Carl has been teaching us is something to which Christians respond because of God's Spirit. And when we listen to him, we begin to think, there's some things that I got to do myself because I belong to him. Oh, well, good hour, thoughtful hour. Who's going to be here next week?
Next week, our friend Justin Brierly is going to be with us. His new book is titled Why I'm Still a Christian, after 2 decades of conversations with skeptics and atheists, the reason I believe.
Does that all fit on one piece of paper?
It does. That's the longest subtitle ever in the history of subtitledom.
You're going to like the time with him, though.
Yeah.
Talks funny, but he says some really good things. Hope you'll join us next week. Same time, same place. We're going to be here. We hope you will be too. And between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide, wide berth.